Good morning. NPS Archaeology Program Series for 2012. My name is Karen Mudar, and I'm an archaeologist in the Washington office. And I invite you to attend the webcast on topics in archaeology that will be held throughout the fall. We're offering them to archaeologists in the Park Service as a way to stimulate discussion, to keep us connected toward the professional side of our lives, which is sometimes kind of hard to do, and to help make connections between us. Everyone has more work than they can do, and it's hard to set those tasks aside to take advantage of learning opportunities. We hope that these webinars will make learning about advances in our field a little easier. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I have some administration I have to take care of. All of the lectures will be recorded, so please be aware of that. Set your phone to mute. Don't put us on hold, or we will be recording your annoying beeps and elevator music, and I'm sure that you don't want it. Please type your questions. Actually, that's not the case for today. I think that our speaker will allow us to interrupt her to give her questions. The recorded webcast will be posted in a variety of places. I'll send out an announcement after we've started posting them, and I'll also make an announcement in the Archeology egram and list the URLs. Information about the webinar schedule will be posted on the Archeology program web pages on Inside NPS. And if you heard about today's speaker indirectly and would like to get invitations, contact me and I'll add you to the mailing list. Also, if you've never heard of the Archeology egram and it sounds intriguing, let me know. I will send you information. My email address is on the announcement that you should be able to see on your computer screen. If you can't see the announcement, you need to start doing some research on the problem right now so that you don't miss the presentation. Today's webinar is the only one that will be held at noon. Our next webinar will be at 3 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time on October 18th. Our speaker will be David G. Anderson at the University of Tennessee. And his talk, The Pleistocene Human Colonization of Interior North America, will provide new information about when, where, and how human beings entered the New World. The routes that early peoples took can be inferred from an examination of the archaeological and environmental record, and they're not as obvious as we might think. David's research sheds light on these migrations. I'm looking forward to this lecture from a former NPS archaeologist, and I hope that you'll join us then as well. Today, Dr. Stacey Camp, University of Idaho, will present some of her illuminating research on the archaeology of Japanese American internment. Outside of the Park Service, few people are aware that during World War II, the U.S. government imprisoned over 120,000 individuals of Japanese heritage solely due to their ethnicity. Despite losing homes and businesses, being relocated to camps, and forced to live under stressful conditions for years, internees creatively interrogated their imprisonment by utilizing and crafting material culture. While the link between material culture and archaeology is obvious, I particularly like the way that Stacey is expanding our research boundaries by using archaeology to examine these uncomfortable manifestations of 20th century xenophobia. Stacey, thank you for being our first speaker.
And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I want to begin by thanking Palin and Karen for inviting me to be the first speaker in this really wonderful and exciting archaeological series. And I also want to thank the National Park Service's Japanese American Confinement Sites Grant Program that supported my research since 2009. I'm also excited to be sharing all my findings and research with such a knowledgeable community of archaeologists, as many of you have worked on landscapes associated with the dark and storied history of Japanese American internment. I welcome any questions as we're going along. I think it'll be easier for someone to just pipe up and ask us over the phone rather than typing it on my screen, because I'll be reading from my paper here. So feel free to interrupt me, won't hurt my feelings, and I'm happy to address any questions as I'm going along with this talk. So I'm going to start with the presentation here. On February 19, 1942, over 120,000 individuals of Japanese heritage were forced to leave the comfort and solace of communities and relocate to internment camps spread throughout some of the harshest locales in the western United States. Seen as enemies of the state during World War II, Japanese Americans were given an ultimatum: abandon their homes within 6 to 21 days or be imprisoned. Housed in dreary, tar-papered military barracks at sites that ranged from former racetracks to prisons, Japanese internees found ways to transform their inhospitable living conditions into places that embodied some semblance of home and of Japanese American culture. These transformations were material in nature. Internees creatively modified and consumed American-made goods, designed, built, and grew elaborate and ornate gardens, and composed expressive artwork utilizing local materials gathered from the desolate camp landscapes and trash middens. As scholars are recognizing now, such activities express not only internee resistance to unjust imprisonment, but also communicated differences and transformations taking place within the Japanese American community itself. My current research project, the Kuski Internment Camp Archaeological Project, contributes to a growing body of scholarship on how these differences were experienced by different age groups, generations, and genders within the Japanese American community. I do so by focusing on the archaeology of Idaho's Kuski Internment Camp, which you can see here in Idaho, pointed with the red arrow. A World War II Japanese American internment camp located here in North Idaho. The Kuski Internment Camp is unique in that the United States government used it as a testing ground for hiring Japanese male internees as a labor force to construct U.S. Highway 12. The only experiment of its kind, Kuski comprised of 265 men who were primarily first-generation Japanese immigrants, and they're also known as Issei. Most of the camp's occupants voluntarily chose to leave other internment camps and the comfort of their families to receive better pay for dangerous and manually intense labor that they would perform at Kuski. At present, archaeological investigations of Japanese American internment camps in the United States have concerned large camps wherein upwards of 7,000 to 10,000 individuals were imprisoned. Archaeologists have faced significant methodological challenges in linking and making inferences about identity-specific behaviors such as an individual's class, gender, generation, race, to particular artifacts recovered from these sites due to the massive size and scale of the camps and their associated middens. The demographic diversity of these camps pose significant difficulties for scholars wishing to study gender, class, and generational behavior at camps, since they are occupied by men and women who represented a diversity of age groups and socioeconomic statuses. Oftentimes, dumps at these camps, such as at Minidoka, Amachi, and Manzanar, feature mixed materials from both administrative housing and internee barracks, further complicating the identification of identity-related behavior. The Kuski internment camp is thus unique in that its population was all males and that its internee barracks were segregated a half a mile away from the administrative housing complexes. As mentioned, Kuski's occupants were primarily first-generation migrants to the United States, also known by the term as Issei. By comparing the data collected from Kuski to previous excavations of internment camps, this project presents an exceptional opportunity to explore how differences in camp size, such as at Kuski, there's only 265 people there versus at bigger camps where there's 10,000 internees, to compare gender composition, females and males at big camps versus all male at population at Kuski, and age groups. At Kuski, it was primarily first-generation Japanese migrants, and at other camps, you have multiple generations internees. How these vectors of identity shape artifact patterning, this is something I'm very interested in. As the sole all-male first-generation Japanese internee camp to be excavated, this study will allow scholars to gain valuable insight into how internment experiences differed across generational and gender lines. These issues require a comparative approach to the archaeology of Japanese American internment. Camps cannot fully be understood in isolation, as internees communicated with and sent packages to other camps and to individuals in and outside of the United States. Individuals like the men at Kuski also moved and were transferred from one camp to another. All of these factors resulted in the tracking of goods and ideas between camps. This requires examining the data collected by other archaeologists studying internment, not only what they collected, but also how they've collected it. Since there are several active academic research projects at internment camps in progress, I decided to visit and observe the project closest to Idaho, and it's not that close, it's a pretty long drive, the Machi Internment Camp Archaeological Project, run by Bonnie Clark at the University of Denver. My goal in doing so was to align my research agenda and my methodologies with other archaeological studies of Japanese American internment. This will allow data to be collected in a more standardized and systematic fashion, which also permits statistically sound comparative opportunities. With the support of the University of Idaho Key Fund grant, I traveled with 2 undergraduates to Dr. Bonnie Clark's Archaeological Field School in the summer of 2010, which involved a 43-hour drive back and forth between Moscow and southeastern Colorado. It's quite an adventure. One of the most common research themes among the archaeology of internment camps is the study of gardens, a theme that has also driven archaeological research at a Machi internment camp here. And the slide we're looking at here, those trees that you see on the landscape on the right-hand side of the slide were placed there by internees. We're looking at the foundations of a bathroom, and if you can see kind of in the middle, I don't know if I can use my pointer if that's visible to other people, but where my pointer at right now is a foot bath that Japanese Americans would use to cleanse their feet, and then they'd step into a shower. So this is a Machi internment camp. Despite being housed in dreary tar-papered military barracks, archaeological studies, such as projects at Manzanar, Amachi, and Minidoka, have demonstrated that Japanese internees engaged in gardening. They did so to transform their inhospitable living conditions into places that embodied some semblance of home and Japanese culture. When we arrived at Amachi, we were given a tour of gardens discovered over the span of Dr. Clark's research project. Here we see Dr. Clark, who's in the blue coat there, discussing how internees used unfamiliar materials such as concrete, locally quarried rocks, scrap metal, marbles, and lumber to compose beautiful communal gardens. The garden here was constructed between the mess hall, where internees would spend much time lined up waiting for food to be served and for a place to sit. And this was not only a garden, but a pond with a little wooden bridge over it. And this next picture gives you a better sense of how internees co-opted local materials, a variety of local materials that you see here in the ground, to make ornate and beautiful hardscapes. This is an entryway garden in front of a barrack with fragments of a flower pot on the former garden surface, which is kind of incredible. I don't know if it's still in situ, but I'd like to think that. This is the same entryway garden featuring an abalone shell, which was sourced back to California. Clearly, the internees sought to recall and recollect their former homes by transporting a delicate shell in the one suitcase they were allowed to bring to internment camps. As a few scholars have noted, gardening practices differed across generational lines. Issei, quote, developed the majority of ornamental gardens since they were the most skilled and knowledgeable about Japanese garden traditions. End quote. And this is an article from Temura. Garden design was also influenced by Issei's place of origin. Issei, living in urban regions, were employed, quote, as experienced ornamental gardeners and landscape professionals, end quote, which was reflected in their stylized, complex garden designs. And that's another quote from Temura's article on gardening and internment camps. Now I'm going to move on to Kuski. In order to investigate differences between camps like Amachi and Kuski, I ran a 4-week University of Idaho-sponsored field school at the former site of the Kuski internment camp. One of the challenges we faced when planning archaeological research at this site is its multiple occupations. The site has a complex, multi-layered occupational history that spans prehistoric, proto-historic, and historic periods. prehistorically and protohistorically speaking, served as a camping and hunting ground on the Nez Perce. The site witnessed new visitors in the 1800s and early 1900s. In September 1893, 27-year-old William Carlin of Vancouver, 28-year-old engineer Himmelwright, and 30-year-old John Harvey Pierce of White Plains, New York, met in Spokane and set out for a hunting trip along the vicinity of what is now the Kuski Internment Camp. They were guided by Martin Spencer and brought 52-year-old George Colgate of Post Falls, Idaho, along as a cook. During their trek, they camped at Apgar Creek, which is where the administrative housing is located, or was located during the internment period, and fished at the mouth of Canyon Creek, which is located right next to the internee barracks. A civilian conservation corps of engineers camp, a CCC camp, which also went by the names of Camp F38 and Camp 38, was built near the Loxa River, which is what became the area known as the Kuski Internment Camp, and it was built in June 1933. It housed 200 individuals who constructed roads, established telephone lines, and fought fires. The camp closed in October 1933. 2 years later, in August 1935, the CCC camp was once again occupied by federal convicts from Fort Worth, Kansas, along with officials and guards. Now known as Canyon Creek Prison Camp, its residents were charged with the task of constructing the Lewis and Clark Highway. The camp was closed in 1943 due to war-related expenses amassed by the Justice Bureau of Prisons. Many of the buildings and landscapes that the Japanese internees would later occupy were built in conjunction with Canyon Creek Prison Camp. Given the site's extensive history, we sought to locate areas of the camp that featured culturally modified landscapes and artifacts associated with the internment period. Using historical archives and maps, we identified 3 zones or areas that were potentially associated with Japanese American and Japanese internees. These areas included the no longer extant internee barracks known as Zone 1, which we see here today, and this is juxtaposing. The bottom of the slide is a modern photograph of what the barracks landscape looked like, and at the top, that area in the rectangle is where the barracks were located. And so that's the same landscape, looks absolutely nothing like the historic landscape, which is a little bit challenging. The second area we were studying, and we'll see photographs of this in a little bit, is an incinerator area that is surrounded by a large trash dump, and we called that Zone 2. And the third and final area is the site of a potential vegetable garden that was harvested by Kuski's internees and possibly the federal prisoners that were there when it was a federal prison, and that we called that area Zone 3. Because internees often had little at their disposal, they frequently modified the existing landscape to suit their cultural preferences. They did so by planting, growing, and tending to beautifully constructed gardens, as well as collecting sediment and stones and crafting them into decorative artwork. Aware of the significance of the natural landscape to Japanese internees, we hired a horticulturalist, Dr. Richard Old, to help us identify and avoid excavating specific plants and elements of the site that either date to the period of internment and or are not native to the area. And here's Richard Old telling us about some ground covering that was probably placed there by the administrators, and this is the administrative housing area. Here's another photograph of some of the plants we found. This is a cherry tree that's near the internee barracks. And here are just some historic photographs of the Kuski Internment Camp. I don't know if you can see the pointer here, but there's this big, big piece of land in between or in the middle of what was called Canyon Creek. And Canyon Creek is still there today. And this piece of landscape was used as a garden by both the federal prisoners and the internees. That is now underwater. I didn't know until I went out to the site during the summer, but it's unfortunately under the water, so we can't study that aspect of the site. Here's some gardens along. I don't think this is a barracks. This is actually some of the administrative housing, or not administrative housing, I'm sorry, offices associated with the camp. And here's a barracks. And there's a garden. I think this building might be a laundry. We're not really sure what the function of some of these buildings was. Here's some more gardens along the barracks. And here's an internee tending to one of the gardens. And this is the last slide of some antlers, kind of interesting, and some more of the gardens here. The University of Idaho's Dr. Robert Hines, who's a geophysicist, along with the University of Denver's April Camp-Whitaker, applied ground-penetrating radar to the former internee barracks and vegetable gardens to identify anomalies such as barrack foundations or disturbed soil from an internee garden. And you can see Robert here with his dog on the side, on the left-hand side of the picture with ground-penetrating radar. You can also see us engaging in shovel testing, and we performed very small shovel tests. It became a lot larger shovel tests, and I'll tell you why in a minute. We performed shovel tests across this landscape, the barracks landscape, and we collected soil samples to try and identify the presence of phosphorus, which can denote the addition of fertilizer and manure to a garden. Due to the general lack of conclusive data from the DPR survey, we opted to perform 38 shovel tests to further explore the internee barracks. As we quickly discovered, the entire internee barracks landscape had been subjected to spill episodes. A number of agencies had been using the abandoned internment camp.
I break in. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to remind people that they should put their phones on mute if they're not actually speaking, so that we don't get additional background noise. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Stacey.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. So a number of agencies had been using the abandoned internment camp, the barracks area, as a place to dump high volumes of highway-related construction debris for many, many years. These spill episodes transformed the internee barracks from its once level landscape into a sloped landscape. This made shovel testing quite interesting as we were pulling out large boulders, pieces of asphalt, and encountering strata with mixed contemporary, historic, and prehistoric artifacts. And here's an example of the shovel test and kind of the big rocks we were finding within them, making them very difficult to complete. And here's one boulder that one of our students pulled out of his 50 by 50 centimeter shovel test that he was quite proud of. As it always seems to happen on an archaeological site, we finally encountered something of historic value after starting to dig the 36 shovel tests in week 2 of the project. At that point, many of my students were quite dismayed and ready to throw in the towel. We hit the foundations of what may be a wash or a laundry house dating to either the prison era or internment era. We then used GPR, ground-penetrating radar, to trace out the foundations of the building and open up one additional excavation unit using the GPR findings. We intend to open up additional excavation units next year in 2013 to see if we can identify the building's function and size. The second area we explored, Zone 2, features an incinerator for organic trash and a very large midden for non-organics associated with the camp. This is where the majority of the material culture I will discuss today was found. Here we conducted a complete surface collection and excavated 3 test units to determine the horizontal and vertical distribution and integrity of the deposit. In the excavated units, the trash deposit extended as deep as 90 centimeters below the surface, at which point we encountered sterile soil in the water table. The midden was so rich in artifacts that it took a team of 2 to 3 experienced historical archaeologists an hour to screen 1 bucket of dirt. We kind of joked that we were screening artifacts and not screening dirt, which made backfilling a little bit difficult. We intend to return to this midden next year to continue excavations and work on defining the midden's horizontal boundaries. What's kind of unique about this midden is that Canyon Creek, which goes through the internment camp, I think I can press on this. Yes, I can. Canyon Creek went right through the internment camp here. This is the internee barracks. And when the camp was occupied, there was this vehicle bridge right here that allowed cars to go over and dump trash. And here's the incinerator. You can see it better close up when you look at historic photographs. But essentially, that vehicle bridge was dismantled when the camp, when the internees left the camp in May 1945. And so really it's been protected by the natural landscape, the existence of this creek. So one of the challenges we faced is actually getting across that creek. It's not that big, but I was just out there a couple weekends ago, and it's pretty knee-high right now. So we're kind of dependent on how the snow season goes. If it's a really difficult snow season, we're not going to be able to get out there until late July or early August, which makes it challenging to run a field school when you're on an academic calendar. So that's great because it's preserved the trash midden, but it's also a challenge for us to get out there. And the bottom picture is a picture of the modern incinerator. Here's excavation in the area in Zone 2. You can see a lot of tin cans. This is actually a half-and-half tobacco tin can that one of my students studied. I think there you go, right there. And we see pictures of those tobacco cans in historic archives. Here's a bottle in the northern wall of one of the excavation units. This brings me to the last area we surveyed and studied, and this is term Zone 3, and this is a location of administrative housing and a former vegetable garden tended by the internees. Administrative housing was located 1/2 mile from the internees barracks. The area is now a campground, and in places it appears to have been substantially modified and altered. We systematically mapped the area, collected soil samples from it, and the results are pending from the soil analysis. We hope to return back to the area to explore the material culture of the administrators, which I think would be very interesting, to see how their material lives differed or mirrored that of the internees. We concluded our field season with a public archaeology day. Oh, and this is another photograph of the administrative housing, historic photograph of administrative housing. And some of the foundations of the homes are still there, which we discovered by doing GPR. So I'd like one of my students to go and do some research on those at some point, or I may end up doing it. So we concluded our field season with a public archaeology day, which involved a display of artifacts excavated from the camp and a lecture by Dr. Priscilla Wagarth, the author of a recently published book on the Kuski internment camp. The Public Archaeology Day gave us a chance to emphasize the importance of the site and the role of the city of Kuski, the role that Kuski plays in site stewardship and cultural resource protection. We also took visitors to the site for a tour of excavations, which you can see here, though we excluded the large trash dump from our tour that's across the creek behind them. It's kind of over here. If you look at the slides, the creek's right back there. So we excluded that area so that we can keep the site undisturbed for future research. Our research continues to be detailed on our project website. We have a blog, which is an additional way we have communicated our findings to the general public. I've also given an upwards of about 30 or 40 talks about the project since 2010, sharing new discoveries that we have happened upon while conducting laboratory research. The laboratory research is still underway, and we are still trying to figure out which horizontal and vertical deposits are definitively associated with the internment camp era. There are a few artifacts that appear to reflect the Kuski internment camp's unique demographic attributes. In what follows, I will talk about some of our findings and interpretations. These findings, of course, may be amended or revisited when we return to Kuski for another archaeological field season in the summer of 2013. And if you have any students or people that want to volunteer in the project, I always welcome new faces. I'm really supportive of having a variety of people come and work on the project. Ceramic studies at Manzanar and Amachi both note that the majority of the ceramics were not government-issued institutional ceramics, like this U.S. quartermaster vessel we found at Kuski, but rather non-institutional ceramics such as fiesta wares and plain semi-vitrified whitewares. Branton, in her study of Manzanar's ceramic assemblage, notes that over 96% of the ceramics encountered during surface collection of the camp's landfill were non-institutional. The same goes for Amachi's surface collection, where 91% of the ceramic assemblage was comprised of non-institutional ceramics. The nearly complete lack of Japanese ceramics at Kuski suggests that women, particularly first-generation Issei, were likely predominantly responsible for obtaining Japanese ceramics. Some of you may be familiar with this ware and have it in your home. One of the most common non-institutional wares found at internment camps is fiesta ware, a bright festival and very durable ware introduced by the Homer Laughlin Ceramic Company in 1936. Fiesta wares were not used inside mess halls, but rather were considered the personal property of internees. There were a number of ways objects like fiesta wares could make their way into internment camps. Goods could be mailed to internees from friends. This is a quote from Clark and Skiles, friends, non-intern family members, or others in their communities. Camp cooperative stores run by internees and mail-order catalogs also provided access to products not provided by the United States government, including clothes, ceramics, toys, and food. However, Clark and Stiles argue that, quote, it is likely that almost all the Japanese ceramics recovered from Amachi were once part of the internees' household goods and were either brought with them or later shipped to the site, end quote. The prevalence of personally owned fiesta wares in Japanese internment camps suggests that ceramics with Japanese motifs of ceramics produced in Japan were not only the only ceramics that symbolized home. In Imagining Consumers, designed from Wedgwood to Corning, Regina Blaskitz argues that Southern California consumers were familiar with the symbolic connotations that came with purchasing fiesta wares. She argues that the designers of fiesta wares targeted Californians by making their wares reference the styles and colors popular during California's Spanish colonial period. Many of the Japanese-American internees at Kuski came from California, as it was the common point of immigration. Perhaps consuming fiesta wares was another way Japanese-American internees were able to recreate their former pre-internment and post-immigration homes. Only a few fragments of Japanese export porcelain were found in the entire collection at Kuski. Despite this minute amount of Japanese wares, the Kuski internment camp's vessel form suggests that Japanese internees were continuing to maintain traditional foodways, or at least some traditional foodways. While we have yet to calculate the minimum vessel count, numerous hollowwares, specifically bowls and teacups, appear to greatly outnumber flatwares such as plates. So for Issei men, it seems that the origin, decoration, and origin of the vessel was less important than its form and the food contained within it. So we have not yet started on the analysis of faunal remains. We have other artifacts besides bowls that tell us something about the men's consumption and eating habits. We found a number of wadded-up tinfoil balls, which I normally would discount to camping trash, but one of our graduate students, Shay Henry, took an interest in it and wanted to study them. After carefully unwrapping a number of them, she discovered that they were in fact chocolate candy wrappers seen here. The candy was manufactured by the Imperial Candy Company of Seattle, Washington, which opened in 1906 and stayed in business until 1974. Here's some advertisements from the company. The company specialized in hard candies. Interestingly, the wrappers captured an important transition in candy marketing in America. Prior to World War I, candy and chocolate advertisements targeted women and stressed their ability to cure female problems. After World War I, chocolate started to be marketed towards men, stressing the vitality they would gain by consuming these chocolate bars. Those ceramics produced in Japan found at Kuski, as I mentioned, are in small in numbers. The fact that they were discovered at Kuski speaks to the interesting gender dynamics at play within internment camps. One of the observations often made by scholars interested in ceramics at internment camps is that they were selected by the female heads of households. What does it mean, then, that we have encountered Japanese ceramics, though small in quantity? Perhaps ceramics decorated with familiar Japanese scenes, such as this medium-sized porcelain bowl fragment, triggered memories of home and family. This bowl, which was researched by an undergraduate student, Jess Workman, exhibits a unique design that was made via a process known as fukuzumi. This involves having an artist place a stencil over the vessel and then spraying or blowing pigment, in this case blue pigment, over the bowl. Once the stencil is pulled away, a design is revealed, which usually has blurry edges, like you can see here with the bird. Another decorative ceramic found during the 2010 excavations was what appears to be also a Japanese export porcelain featuring a moriage design. Moriage refers to a raised clay decoration placed on a ceramic vessel. Given the stylistic features of this vessel, it appears it is a piece of Japanese Nippon-era ware, made for export out of Japan from 1891 through 1921, or potentially made in Japan-era ware, which dates from the 1920s through World War II. This decorative piece appears to feature portions of a dragon's tail, especially when compared to pictures of a dragon vessel found in Joan F. Van Patten's Collector's Encyclopedia of Nippon Porcelain. The interior of another associated sherd exhibits brown luster, which is frequently used in the opening of Nippon-ware vessels, according to Priscilla Wagars. Was this a gift given to an internee sent by a family member, or did men also consume ceramic goods as a nod towards their ethnic heritage? I just threw this in because the Forest Service archaeologists love this creamer. But I'm kind of curious as to why we find a creamer associated with some of the Japanese-American internee wares. And so I'd like to study a little bit more about this. And as we move forward and try and interview some of the people associated with the camp, we're hoping to find some answers as to what maybe this creamer was used for. And here's kind of one of the many propaganda photos produced by the United States government, and this is a photograph of a dining table that we presume to be in the Kuski internment camp. And what's interesting about this photograph is if you look at the table and the wares on the table, it's what we would consider kind of traditional Anglo-American wares or setting with the plates. And this is interesting when you juxtapose it with the archaeological data, which shows a preponderance of bowls. Artifacts associated with gaming and leisure appear to reflect clear differences between Issei and Nisei, and Nisei refers to second-generation Japanese immigrants or Japanese Americans, men's experiences in internment camps. As one internee at Arizona's Poston internment camp described, Japanese women tended to shun gambling in their communities and were critical of men who engaged in such activities. This appears to be reflected in the assemblages of other internment camps. Only a few gaming pieces or go pieces that are small objects that are easily lost have been recovered. At Kuski, a diverse range of gaming artifacts were found during excavation, including what appears to possibly be a bone mahjong piece. And I don't have a good photograph of that right now, but I will get one at some point. In this image, we see a wide variety of gaming pieces, some that appear to be manufactured on site from stone, mortar, and clay, and others that appear to be mass manufactured. These pieces may have been used in a number of traditional Japanese and Chinese games. According to oral histories, the types of games Japanese men played were dependent on their generation, age, and class standing. For instance, Hana, a game that originated in Japan, was popular amongst lower-class gardeners, fishermen, older produce men, farmers, and migratory farm laborers. Some oral histories suggest that mahjong died out of favor right before World War II, although the archaeological record at Kuski suggests otherwise. Perhaps Japanese-American men used games like mahjong to craft some semblance of home and recall their pre-internment lives. This is one of my favorite artifacts from the camp. I think everyone that sees it says the same thing. One of the most important finds from the 2010 field season similarly suggests that an internee's gender and year of migration shapes artifact patterning at internment camps. Here we see what appears to be part of the Japanese tradition of suzuke, the act of collecting and arranging stones into gardens, landscape scenes, animal shapes, and human forms. We have several fragments of this artwork. Right now, we estimate that we have a minimum of 3 vessels in our collection representing this artwork tradition. With no access to traditional materials, internees crafted portable art, such as this piece, to continue cultural practices. Similar-looking art made out of rock and sediment has been featured in museum displays, with pieces serving both artistic and functional roles ranging from rock-decorated pencil holders to vases. Interestingly, objects such as the one pictured here have not been found at other internment camp excavations, suggesting that this form of artwork may be specific to first-generation male Japanese immigrants. Evidence of the continuation of this practice at other internment camps is documented in one photograph found at Fort Missoula Internment Camp, a camp from which many of Kuski's internees came. The photograph illustrates men, not women, holding and displaying what one presumes to be their own artwork. Similar-looking art made out of rock and sediment has been featured in books like Priscilla's on Kuski's internment camp. As Jane DeLucier, a historian of Japanese internee art, has argued, artwork that required tools was usually performed by men, though there are a few instances in which both women and men transgressed what were generally strict gender lines dictated by a patriarchal Japanese kinship structure. Tools were typically perceived as contraband within internment camps. However, at Kuski, the men were often given free rein of the camp, as the overseers recognized that there was really nowhere to flee in this remote setting. And another thing that makes Kuski really unique is that it didn't have barbed wires around the camp, because essentially there's nowhere to go there. And it's still like that to this day. It's really out of nowhere. They were even given keys to vehicles and access to gasoline, as one of my students, Paige Davies, discovered in her study of keys found during excavations at the camp. The next set of data tells a broader story of internee resistance to camp conditions. Officials often meticulously censored letters sent out by the Japanese internees, which historians have used as primary data sources. The archives from Kuski are filled with conflicting accounts of the medical facilities, hygienic products, and medicinal items made available to internees. In fact, the conditions at Kuski were so bad that camp residents composed a petition in Japanese to camp officials requesting that, among many other things, quote, necessary accommodation for first aid be established in or around the working place, end quote, and proper clothing be provided given the rough work conditions. At the time, internees writing the petition claimed that there was, quote, not even a single medical officer to look after the lives of 130 persons, end quote, at the incredibly inaccessible work camp. And it's still like this today. Medical facilities are very hard to come by. You have to go about 3 hours to get to anything with a doctor. Archival memos written by camp managers suggest that the petitioner's requests were met immediately. Government officials wishing to uphold the rules of the Geneva Convention and health and safety standards set by federal and state legislatures penned such documents, calling into question the validity of their statements. These artificial teeth, we'll see them in just a minute, and dentures stand as a reminder that internees often had to fight for adequate care. They represent the outcomes of internee protest and defiance. So here's, you never want to find teeth on an archaeological site, but luckily once we wash these teeth, we notice that they actually have a gold number on them that you can see in this photograph here, thankfully. And here's a picture of the Japanese dentist that was there for a time. And I'll skip this inkwell. It's kind of an interesting piece. There's another picture of a dentist there. All right, Callie Oliver's research on medicinal products found at the camp uncovered a Japanese-manufactured patent medicine bottle predating the occupation of the internment camp. It was manufactured between 1929 and 1943 by the Wakamoto Pharmaceutical Company. We determined this by translating Japanese characters found on the neck of the bottle fragment and then contacting the Wakamoto Pharmaceutical Company, which is actually still in existence today. And I've been very lucky that I've had several students who read and speak and write Japanese who have been helpful in talking to the Wakamoto Pharmaceutical Company. And this was what was called a source of used gastrointestinal supplement that was infused with vitamin B. And we know this because they were kind enough to send an advertisement of this medicine to us when we were corresponding with them. And so you can see that's a picture of the bottle we have in our collection. And here's an example of what the bottle would have looked like complete. And here are the fragments of the bottle that we've cataloged and found in the collection so far. Interestingly, all Japanese manufactured products were banned from importation into the United States during World War II. So how did this medicinal bottle, one not documented in purchase orders, and we have lots of them in our copious archives, make it into the internment camp? One possibility is that a Japanese doctor brought it to the camp with him while he was practicing there. Another possibility is that internees brought medicinal products of their own into the camp in the one suitcase they were allowed to bring. In either case, this delicate glass bottle must have contained medicine that was extremely important to a Japanese-American internee, as it was one of the few things he chose to place in his suitcase. Another medicinal product found during the project is an eye serum made by Marines. According to Kelly Warren's archival research, nearly 50% of the men at Kuski experienced eye troubles at any given time, problems that were directly related to the dusty and dangerous highway construction work they were conducting. Another student, Jamie Capuana, found equally interesting information on some perplexing buttons recovered during the Kuski excavations. A wide range of button types were found in the camp, including those that you see pictured here. One of the more interesting buttons is pictured and stamped with the manufacturer's mark, City Button Works, New York. According to Jamie's research, City Button Works only stamped their name on the backs of buttons like the one seen here during World War I. Given the site's long-term occupation history, one might assume that this button was used prior to the internment camp period. However, the button was found on the surface of the site and in context with other internment era-related artifacts, like the gaming pieces we saw earlier. After Jamie conducted extensive archival research, she discovered that the internees were receiving their work clothing from Army surplus stores that carried clothing used in past wars. The U.S. Prison Service buttons pictured here in the middle of the slide were likely worn during the site's prison camp era, when the site was known as Canyon Creek Federal Prison, and internment camp era, since many of the employees who worked at Canyon Creek Federal Prison continue to be employed as staff members when the site became the Kuski internment camp, and that was a big problem because a lot of the people who worked there as prison officials treated the internees as if they were prisoners, and so some of the internees made formal complaints against the people that were working there. This was verified during Jamie's archival research, where she discovered orders for guard uniforms and buttons. These documents discuss limiting the adornment of a button, like the one seen here, to officers rather than guards. This suggests that there existed a clear class structure within the prison and internment camp employees, which they would visibly display using buttons such as these. Together, the artifacts recovered from the 2010 field season's work at Kuski tell stories that both complement and defy what can be found in the historical records. If it wasn't for this excavation, we would have no idea that internees went to great lengths to transform Kuski into a culturally familiar landscape. The artwork, gaming pieces, decorative ceramics, and Japanese medicinal products discussed today are a testament to this, as they are not discussed in the archives. As hopefully I've shown today, archaeology therefore has the potential to go beyond the historical records and to contribute to larger questions about how gender and generational differences were expressed and enacted through material practices inside the World War II Kuski internment camp. Thank you very much, and I'm just going to put my slide up of thank yous. Hopefully I haven't missed too many people. There's been so many people that have been a part of this project, and I hope in about 5 or 10 years I can write a book about what we've discovered. I've approached this project from a very collaborative perspective, and I've involved students in it from kind of day one before we even went out to the site. So it's really important that I continue in that tradition. So my vision for this project is that we'll continue it for maybe another 10 years and produce some sort of edited volume with students' work and my work as well. So I'm happy to take any sorts of questions or comments, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk, Stacey. Do we have any questions? Stacey, what is the status of the land now that the camp is on?
It's Forest Service property. It was historically and prehistorically Nez Perce land, and there's kind of a tenuous history behind how the United States government acquired that land for the Nez Perce. So when we set out to do this project, I've consulted with the TIPO, the Tribal Preservation Officer of the Nez Perce, as well as the Forest Service, and that's part of the Forest Service's process as well. But so it's on Forest Service land, but it's really out in nowhere. It's along a highway that a lot of people travel to go to Montana, and people are very curious about this site in the town, and the people that come to visit. There's a couple resorts out there. It's a beautiful place to go if you haven't figured that out from the photographs. There's a lot of whitewater river rafting and outdoor activities, as well as this kind of weird movement called glamping that's become very popular, where people go and camp in these kind of like colonial-looking tents outside. So there's these resorts out there. Some are kind of expensive and some are a little bit cheaper. And a lot of people from the outside, a lot of people from California, from the West come and stay there, and they've been asking about the Q-Ski internment camp. I'm not sure how they learn about it. I know we had NPR come out while we were there, but according to resorts, a lot of people are very curious about the camp, but there's no signage, and the Forest Service is really strapped to do any sort of regular work there in terms of maintaining the trails. So our hope is that we get this place listed on the National Register of Historic Places, get some signage out there, and I think the Forest Service is working on that the last I heard, but I'd like my archaeological data to be a part of that signage to tell the stories that I've told today. So right now, you would go there and you would have no clue that this was an internment camp, absolutely no clue.
Huh, how interesting.
Yeah, it's very sad that the historical memory of the camp was kind of lost and that it had been dumped on. I don't think it was intentional, but it's been dumped on for many, many years. And that's kind of a sad aspect of a lot of internment camps' histories, is that they've just been neglected, forgotten, and not preserved for the people that now want to study them, the Senate communities, the stakeholder communities that want to pilgrimage out to them. So I'm hoping to change that. I have a lot on my plate the next couple of years, but my long-term goal really is to get the site on the National Register of Historic Places and get some signage out there. And a few of my students have already started the nomination process for me. Again, I've tried to include students on every step of the process. That's a very important thing to me.
Well, good luck with that.
Thanks.
Do we have any more questions or comments on Stacey's presentation? Well, Dr. Camp, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to share what we found. And I welcome any comments or questions through email. I'm happy to entertain them. And I'll be going to the American Anthropological Association's annual meeting in San Francisco. If anyone will be there, I'll be giving a similar talk. And I'd be happy to meet you if you'll be there.
Are you going to the Society for American Archaeology meeting also?
You know, I wish I was going. I think it's in Honolulu, right?
It is.
I am not going to that. I think I'm going to England in January for the Society for Historical Archaeology's annual conference, and that kind of blows my budget for the year. So, but I usually go to SAAs and my students have presented on Q-Ski at SAAs in the past. So we'll probably be there the next year when it's a little more reasonable.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a really great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.